Her publication record spans 4 decades, 40 years, right? So of her close to 200 peer-reviewed publications, with the vast majority being in really high-tier, prestigious scientific and clinical journals, her first was in 1975. I happen to know that she's a year younger than I am, and I graduated from high school in 1976. So doesn't really kind of add up, which would make her equivalent to a sophomore in high school when she published her first scientific publication, which happened to be in the journal Lancet, which again is one of the highest respected medical journals in the world. And it's no coincidence that all 4 authors on the first 10 publications in her CV had the last name of Murray, with the abbreviations MJ, NJ, AB, and Megan, MB. In fact, the first, that was a span from 1975 to 1995 that bore those authors. And so she graciously accepted our invitation to share the story of how that came to be. And for that, I give you Dr. Megan Murray.
Thanks, Randy. I thought you weren't going to tell. You know, if someone had told me when I was a young girl, the same age of the young girls who are here today, that I would be speaking at a conference as a representative woman in science, I just couldn't possibly have believed it. In, say, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, it wasn't just that I wasn't interested in science. I wasn't interested in science. I wasn't very good at it. It was that I actually hated it. I mean, I hated it with a passion. And I can remember the first day that passion crystallized. I was in a science class in 4th grade, and our very nice, very sincere science teacher started a new unit. It was on energy. And he first started talking about potential energy and kinetic energy, and yeah, I could get it. You know, there's a rock on the top of a hill, rolls down. And then he moved on to electrical energy, right? And he told us that in electricity worked because there were little negative charges that ran in wires, and that those attracted positive charges, and that looked something like this. And that we weren't really sure that these little electrons were actually mass. They might be energy, or maybe mass and energy was the same thing. And I was really, really confused. And I looked around and I thought, this is fundamentally challenging everything I have ever thought about the world, right? This guy is telling me something that just makes no sense to me. What are negative and positive charges? And I looked around the room and no one else was upset. I mean, I'm sure my heart was pounding. And furthermore, I looked around the room. Here's another, he also told us to just turn the lights on. And I saw all these boys, right, nodding knowingly and raising their hands, right? And this is not my class, but it could have been, right? So I went home that night and I was really upset. I asked my father, so what's going on here? And he explained to me there were little negative charges that went in the wires. And so what do you mean? There's like little negative signs? That doesn't mean anything to me. After many tears, I still didn't get it. I never really got it. And I decided right then and there that I hated science and I would never, ever be a scientist. No insight whatsoever. So, you know, the next year things got much better. I transferred to a girls' school, and this was my girls' school. That's actually not us playing field hockey. That's a picture from 1918. And yeah, I'm old, but I'm not that old. Right, and the great thing about this school was not only were there no boys raising their hands and nodding knowingly, but even better, there was almost no science class to speak of. Now, don't get me wrong. Going to girls' school and this was in Minneapolis, Minnesota, it was a wonderful thing. And in retrospect, I agree with the many women academics who credit their success to having gone to a girls' school. Our curriculum was fabulous in languages and history and English. We had the best drama program probably, anywhere. But in that period, and this is the 60s, right? Girls' schools didn't see a whole lot of use for science, and between, say, 5th and 8th grade, I don't think I learned a single thing in science, and I didn't regret it whatsoever. So in 1972, my life and my family's lives changed in a way that really affected my future and my siblings' future and my parents' future in a huge way. My father decided he was going to take a sabbatical. He was a cardiologist at the University of Minnesota, and he had previously worked with a colleague, Christian Barnard, who had done the first heart transplant, and he wanted to go spend the year working with Christian Barnard. The only fortunate thing about this was that Christian Barnard had since left Minnesota and moved back to his native South Africa. And so that is where my father was proposing that we would go and spend the year. So we weren't all that politically savvy. We didn't have the internet back then, but this was 1972. And while the general boycott against South Africa didn't come into being until the 1980s, there had been a boycott called for in the 50s. And by 1972, and this is actually a protest in England in 1972, there was a general academic boycott, at least out of Britain. And so, well, we probably didn't know that at the time. We nonetheless knew enough to put our foot down and say, you can go to South Africa, but we won't be joining you. We were 14 and 17 at the time, so I'm not sure what we thought we were going to do. So it fell to my mother to keep the peace, and she quickly worked out a solution that we could all accept. It turned out my mother is an adventurous soul, she's passed away, but who had probably been hankering for years to break out of the role of a suburban housewife that she was sort of stuck in Minneapolis, and she now saw her chance. So a few weeks later, she proposed a new plan. This was that we would spend the first half of the year that year in some other country in Africa doing medical work, and then the second half we would go to South Africa with my father. So we all agreed to that. And a few weeks later, because we weren't given a lot of notice on this trip, we found ourselves in England, in a town called Solihull, where we were in the process of buying 2 bare-bones Land Rovers, which we were then going to drive across the Sahara Desert. So there were 5 of us, 3 kids, and my parents. We bought these 2 cars, and we proceeded to take there's 2 routes across the Sahara. This one's the Tamanrasset route through Algeria to aim for this town called Difa in southeast Niger, where we were going to spend the year. So it was a very challenging journey. Here's my father dug these pictures up for me. He was quite thrilled. He's 96, and I said, "Do you have any pictures from back in those days?" And this is one he sent me. This is me and my brother, who's has just finished driving for a long day and is getting some well-earned rest under the shade. It was hot, the roads were poorly marked, we got lost once or twice, much to the consternation of my risk-averse father, who was probably totally frustrated that the teenagers really weren't too concerned, and neither was my mother. Fortunately, when we'd wake up in the morning, there would be tracks and we would be able to follow them, and so we made it across the desert. But as we got further and further south, we began to realize that we were really, this was a really serious situation that we were finding ourselves in. So by 1972, the Sahel drought that had begun a few years earlier had really reached its peak. And we were entering an area with where it had been extremely drought-ridden for years and famine-ridden. And we were starting to see the corpses of camels that had died of dehydration. This is a donkey carcass. All along the road, children would, when we drove through villages, children would chase the cars with bowls looking for water. So little water in towns that really people were quite desperate. The temperatures hovered around 120 degrees, and when we arrived in Difa, it was at the peak of the hottest season of the year. There was very little food to be bought in the market, and within a few months, we'd all lost a significant amount of weight, probably much more than was good for us. This is Difa now, and it's not that much different from Difa when I knew it. I just found this as one of the stock photos. But it was a crossroads of a small town then, but a crossroads for lots of different people traveling across the Sahara or through the Sahel. And when we got there, we found that we didn't really know what to expect. I didn't know what arrangements my mother had made with our teachers about what we would do when we took this time off from school. And it was just as well, because when we got to there, we realized there was no high school, and that was okay, because there was a lot of work to be done in the hospital that was completely unstaffed, but which my father had gone to start up and staff in the first place. So we were put to work, we 3 children, in various capacities doing medical work. And here I am delivering medicines. We had all sorts of different jobs, helping with minor surgery, especially preparing food and feeding malnourished kids. My 17-year-old brother became very adept at putting in IVs in dehydrated children, and this is another stock photo, really, but it could have been DEFA when I was there in 1972. He more than once served as an anesthesiologist on the few occasions when my father had to pull out his old textbooks and try major surgery for the first time in 30 years. Fortunately, our patients actually did survive. I had, because of my excellent private girls' school education, I actually spoke pretty good French, and no one else in the family did. So I was a translator and could speak to people who really had poor French in the town, but it got us by, and I did a lot of the social interaction. I made some friends. Here I am with some of the young women in the town who were passing through. You'll notice that even in 1972, black lipstick was already a thing in DEFA. We all learned a great deal during that period. So we saw an enormous spectrum of different infectious diseases, ranging from the very frequent falciparum malaria to lymphatic filariasis to every possible manifestation of tuberculosis. We also learned a great deal about human undernutrition and how it interacts with these infections. It was impossible for even the most science-averse girl not to become engaged in these matters, which were really matters of life and death. Some of our observations, as you've heard, have eventually ended up becoming academic papers. But for us at the time, the most consequential thing I think we all learned was about the profound disparity in resources between rich and poor countries. It wasn't enough that we were there manning this hospital that had been empty up until that point. We didn't actually have the medicines we needed to treat people, and in the absence of those medicines, people died. We also learned how misplaced foreign aid can be. At one point, we were told that a truck containing medicines was coming to us from the capital, which was at least a week's drive away. On the way, we were radioed and told that the truck had overturned, that there'd been an accident. Then we heard later it was righted, it was on its way again, and finally we heard it was going to be here any day. So we were terribly excited, and when it did arrive, we saw that the cardboard boxes that the materials had been in had all broken, and there was stuff strewn all over the back of the car. But when we went to see what it was, we found that it was cans of marmalade. In fact, these cans of marmalade that had been donated by the French government to feed hungry people in Niger. Needless to say, we never made it to South Africa that year. We waited for replacements, they never came, and after waiting longer than they could, we finally left and went home. When I got back to high school, I found that my girls' school had now merged with the boys' school. And now there was a full range of science courses. In fact, there were some quite good science classes. Somehow my mother convinced the principal of the school that I should just go back into the same class I had left, and she should close her eyes to the fact that I had missed more than a year of school. And so they did that. They did those kinds of things in those days. But they stuck me back in classes that weren't quite full, and some of those were science classes, advanced biology and physics. I didn't exactly excel in those classes. I didn't really love them very much, especially in physics. I remember those horrible inertia problems. So still, drives me nuts. But I was the only girl in any of those classes, and at the end of the year, I ended up winning the girls' science prize. This was actually totally mortifying for me because I knew that every single boy in the class knew that I wasn't a very good physics student. But it wasn't as mortifying as what happened the next year, which was when the academic papers on our observations from DEFA were published in The Lancet under the titles, the authorship of Murray, 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 and Murray. In fact, this was so mortifying to me that I actually haven't been able to come to terms with it for decades. I think it was only when I started having graduate students and I realized that their contributions to some of the papers that they had written were had no more effect than what I had done in DEFA, that I began to start adding those papers back to my CV, and that's how Randy saw them. Anyway, fast forward. I went to college where I did not study science, but majored in philosophy and history. And when I graduated, I spent months looking for a job that would allow me to travel to some distant place. And I finally ended up working in a refugee camp in Thailand with an Intergovernmental Committee for European Migration, which is now the Intergovernmental Organization for Migration. So you may see refugees landing, you may not see them anymore, but in the past, you would have seen refugees landing in major airports with bags, and they would be labeled like this. We moved refugees to the countries that they would be resettled in. And one of the things I was doing was helping people from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam be resettled in either the US or Europe, Australia or New Zealand. And they had to undergo medical screening, so screening for infections, sexually transmitted diseases, tuberculosis, other exemptive diseases that would exempt them from traveling. And then if they had TB, we would treat them, and once they were treated, they could be moved. So I was once again exposed to TB. I was exposed to TB, but I was exposed to my interest in TB. So after a while, I enjoyed this quite a lot. We were working in these camps. We were moving people by the tens of thousands. But I started to feel like I would rather be doing what the doctors were doing, the doctors doing the treating and the screening, than what I as an administrator was doing. And so I returned to the US to finish my pre-med requirements and start med school. So at med school, I once again learned that I was not a huge fan of being in science class. I struggled with courses like neuroanatomy. I just really couldn't tell the difference between the pons and the medulla. It just all looked like kind of not very spatial, and it looked like worms, and to me. But by the time I got to the clinical training, the years I'd spent in Thailand and in Africa started to pay off, and I had some more confidence in what I was doing, and I started to really enjoy my training. I mean, there were ups and downs. So my third year, I enrolled in a required surgery rotation at Mass General Hospital. I was the only woman in the class of about 20 students, and there were no women faculty and no women residents on service when I was there. This is not actually one of those classes. It's probably taken many years later, but it is a neuroanatomy residency group from Mass General. No women to be found. The schedule was brutal. We were on every other night with no weekends off. And for a minute or two, I got brainwashed by the sort of intensity of that, so that I thought, maybe I will be a surgeon. But fortunately, my total lack of dexterity and the fact that I couldn't tell the pons from the medulla, kicked in. So I graduated from medical school in 1990 and spent the next 4 years doing an internal medicine residency and a fellowship in infectious disease at Mass General. It was an incredible period, actually. It was amazing training. I'm not sure one could get the same kind of residency training today, now that the very much needed restrictions on hours are in place. My husband jokingly calls it, oh, you were trained in the days of the giants. But in some ways it was true, and I was extremely fortunate to be exposed to a number of teachers who were extraordinary leaders in 20th century medicine. So here's us during our residency when we were quite exhausted. Here's another stock photo of residents. But in these residency rounds, we would be taught by these attendings, and we just had a parade. Mort Schwartz is probably the leader of infectious disease in academics and medicine in the 20th century in the US, followed by Roman DeSanctis, followed by Gil Daniels of endocrinology. I mean, it was extraordinary. But like the portraits that often line the walls of medical schools, all of these giants were men. Right? We had very few women attendings, and when we did have those women attendings, they weren't those giants. They were people who were new to this, lacking the confidence and the charisma, in some cases, of our male attendings. I remember one episode where a very new attending, I think it was her first time doing it, that really disrupted our incredibly complex and demanding schedule by coming in wanting to do residency rounds at 9 a.m. instead of our usual 7 a.m. And at the time, I didn't have that much sympathy for her, but the tables were soon turned because a couple of years later, I was pregnant with my first child during my third year of residency. So back in those days, and maybe it's still the case. Giving birth during residency was not very common, and it really wasn't much appreciated because our scheduling was so tight that any time someone took off meant that someone else was working harder than they needed to, and we were working pretty hard. I pooled all my vacation time together, and I took a couple of months off, but as soon as I came back to work, I was back on every third night. I was determined to continue nursing my baby daughter for as long as I possibly could. And I did that with the help of my musician husband, who drove her to the hospital. I would run out to the car, say, okay, I have to go to the bathroom, and I'd run out to the car, nurse her in the car. If the police came by and said, you can't park there, we would just drive round and round the block until she'd finished nursing. And then I'd run in as if nothing had happened. It was a tough time, but at the end of that, I went on to go to the School of Public Health. I had done infectious diseases, and I knew that I didn't want to work in a basic science lab, and based on my hate of science. And I knew that I wanted to work on TB. So I ended up in a doctoral training program in epidemiology at the School of Public Health. I have to say, I had no idea when I started how I was going to pay my tuition at the end of when my term bill came. I just did it. I signed up. They assumed I was going to pay. I was moonlighting to support our child care. My husband was a jazz musician and was helping with it, but we struggled for a while. But things worked out. My advisor found a grant that covered my first year tuition, and then I applied consecutively for a Howard Hughes Investigator Award and then an NIH training grant, which covered the rest of my training. I was really lucky. I think it's really hard to get those grants now. It was probably easier back then. But I couldn't escape the feeling that early success had been possibly due to the fact that maybe people made it easier for women to get these grants. Of course, we now know that's crazy, right? But I was worried at the time. I see data like this, and I realize that this was delusional. This was a study produced by the BMJ a few years ago, which shows how UK funding for training for women in research is really much less than training for men. But I didn't really believe it at the time. They had a number of lucky breaks during that period. One of them was that although there was no one to work with in TB when I went to the School of Public Health, so I was sort of floundering around knowing that that's what I wanted to do, I couldn't find a mentor. Barry Bloom, who is a world leader in this area, moved there during my training. He became the dean at the School of Public Health. So Barry's an immunologist, not an epidemiologist, but he has a passion for training people in TB. He wants to see his legacy of TB research go on, and he wants to see this problem dealt with. And he was enormously supportive of many people who have now trained in TB, both men and women. But I still didn't actually have a mentor in epidemiology. So I did what one does when one can't find somebody who can help them get data. I entered the data-free zone of mathematical modeling and decided I could just model TB even if I didn't have any real access to information. And so that's what I did for the first few years. My mother, who was still holding out that maybe I would be a surgeon, I think that was what she wanted to be, she reminded me that I had been pretty bad at math in high school. And in fact, I think I may have failed an algebra test in 7th grade. But I had found that I'd gotten better and better at math as time went by. And these things, you don't really use these things until you need them, and then you learn them. So I found that I quite enjoyed my spell of mathematical modeling. But another lucky break happened, which was that I was asked by my former classmates, this is Jim Kim and Paul Farmer, way back, who went on to, well, actually at that time had founded the non-governmental organization Partners in Health. So Paul and Jim were MD anthropologists. They had finished around the same time I had finished at medical school, and we sort of knew each other vaguely. They'd both gone into infectious diseases. And they knew that I was working on modeling TB. They had set up this NGO. Paul had done his PhD work in Haiti, where it really focused on, and as a doctor as well, it was focused on how to provide health care to the poorest of the poor in those kinds of settings. So he had first worked on HIV in Haiti, then on tuberculosis, and now he and Jim were focusing on drug-resistant tuberculosis and had set up a project in Lima, Peru. And they came to me and asked me if I could use the models I'd worked on to address the question of drug resistance in Lima, and specifically to counter an argument that was being put out by the national TB programs and the World Health Organization at the time. So Jim has gone on to become the president of the World Bank, which is great for those who are interested in seeing that the poor get reasonable health care. Paul has gone on to be the chair of many things, including my department, so he's my boss. So it did just kind of, it came together. So our work at that time, the World Health Organization was addressing the question of TB. This was about 95, maybe 99. And through something called DOTS. DOTS stands for Directly Observed Therapy, short course, but it actually means more than just treating people and observing them to be treated. It means a whole regimen of a particular kind of diagnostic, which was based on microscopy, but not necessarily on culture. A treatment with a standardized drug course, so standard drugs that were given rigorously, and then a monitoring evaluation, a good supply of drugs, and government involvement. And the idea was that if we gave people good care and they adhered to therapy, we would stop the emergence of new drug resistance. And that is probably true, but there's actually two routes to drug resistance for patients to get drug-resistant TB. The first is they can somehow get suboptimal therapy. It might be through non-adherence, but it could also be through not getting their proper treatment, to having poor or counterfeit drugs, to having comorbidities that cause them to have low levels of drug. But the other way is when there's already drug-resistant TB in the population and it simply is transmitted to someone else. So DOTS interrupts inadequate treatment, but it does nothing to interrupt further transmission. And there was already a lot of drug-resistant TB out there in the world by the year 2000. So WHO was arguing that there were three reasons why DOTS was a reasonable approach, even against drug-resistant TB. The first was that the second-line drugs that we were using or the people were using generally, didn't work all that well, and they didn't work in resource-limited settings. So Partners in Health did some very good clinical work and showed that if in a rigorous program that you could achieve similar outcomes in MDR-TB in Lima, Peru, in the shanty towns we worked in as they could in the US. They also argued that the drugs were too expensive, and they formed a coalition called the Green Light Committee that negotiated with drug companies to get prices down, and they got prices way down. These drugs are used for very little else, and they managed to talk the drug companies into really reducing their prices. But their third argument was a biological argument about the transmissibility of strains that had acquired drug resistance mutations. So they said, when organisms acquire mutations that they wouldn't have in wild type, it confers a fitness cost, and that fitness cost will be manifested in reduced transmissibility. So we don't really have to worry about it that much. These people they're sick, and that's really too bad, but they're not going to transmit to other people. And so it's not a public health problem, it's sort of an individual patient problem. So I really doubted that, but I was really interested in this and I wanted to pursue it. I went back to the literature that they were referring to. So there was a study in the late 1950s by a group called Middlebrook and Cohn that had selected for drug-resistant TB to the drug INH, which is isoniazid, in the laboratory. So they grew these organisms under selection pressure from drugs, selected for these INH-resistant strains, and then put them into animal models. And they found that some INH-resistant strains were less likely to cause disease, and the animals died at a much slower rate than those exposed to drug-sensitive TB, to INH-sensitive TB. They also noticed that, the main mechanism by which INH becomes resistant is through a catalase peroxidase called CatG. INH is a prodrug, so it has to be activated by this gene's product in order to become the activated drug. And CatG produces a catalase. So they had already noted that INH-resistant strains selected in the lab were usually catalase negative. They had also written a paper a couple of years later, which was actually pretty interesting, where they found that there were catalase-positive INH-resistant strains circulating in clinical strains. And if they did the same experiment, but used INH-resistant strains that they had obtained from patients rather than selecting in the lab, that they got a mishmash of results that they found very difficult to interpret. But some strains did fine, and in fact better than drug-sensitive strains, and some did worse. Of course, we know now that these drug resistance mutations are highly heterogeneous, and there's no reason why one type of INH resistant would be similar to another in terms of a fitness cost. So that has been shown since then. This is a study actually done by Dr. Ordway, who I believe is here, or has been here, which showed that there were, if you took clinical strains of INH-resistant TB, that they fell into three groups: those that grew less well in mouse lung, those that grew as well, and those that grew a little bit better in mouse lung than drug-sensitive strains. And again, that made total sense, because once we knew what those mutations were, we found that if you make isogenic strains with different mutants, that some mutants did really well, while others didn't. Furthermore, the ones that don't do that well can have secondary mutations that actually restore their fitness. And so while you might see a high-cost mutation, it's often accompanied by another mutation that confers or reduces that fitness cost. And that was consistent with what we had observed in our treatment programs in Lima, where we'd find families like this one, where we could show that the strain of TB that infected, I think, 8 different family members, all of whom were sick, had the same genotype and had a similar drug resistance profile in all 8 people, most of whom were coming in with their first episode of TB. So I started using some of that information to parameterize models on the trajectory of what should happen to MDR-TB over time, given different policy strategies. If you focus only on reducing the new emergence of drug-resistant TB, what will happen? If you actually treat drug-resistant TB, how will that matter? So we developed these mathematical models using differential equation modeling to capture that trajectory. And this was many years ago. But what you see here, and it's really guided most of the work I've done since then, is that if you don't do anything, eventually drug-resistant strains will outcompete drug-sensitive strains that you are treating. And because in the natural world, the most fit strain will be the one that is selected for, these drug-resistant strains will become more fit over time, and that we can expect that without an intervention, that we will see the rise of TB. So that was actually something that was that finding and subsequent findings that we've done using mathematical modeling was incorporated into some of the policy recommendations that were worked out with the WHO. And over the past 10 to 15 years, there's been a real change, a sea change in the way that the World Health Organization has approached drug-resistant TB, so that they are now doing something called DOTS Plus, and I think they've moved on to yet a DOTS Plus Plus, but which incorporates the diagnosis and adequate treatment of drug-resistant TB. So a time when my collaboration with clinicians and modelers really was very gratifying in seeing these kinds of changes. So around that time, now we're kind of getting up to about 2003-04, Eric Lander opened the Broad Institute in Boston. This was the beginning of genomics, and he, at the time, when he started this institute, which is now a big, thriving genetics center, was looking for collaborators and for people with infectious disease projects. He had cancer and infectious disease, et cetera. And Barry Bloom made sure that I was put in front of him, along with a lot of other people, to talk about potential projects. And I was surprised and of course, a little mortified when, in fact, he was interested in sequencing of drug-resistant TB strains. And of course, I thought, well, I was the only woman in the room. He must have picked me because, of his implicit bias for women, right? But no, I suspect that wasn't the case. I think in retrospect, I was probably the only person who had access to clinical strains of anything. And so it made sense. And I thought oh, this is the best thing since sliced bread. And it sort of was. It took another 6 or 7 years before our very small sequencing project of 8 TB strains came to fruition. They were very slow to be sequenced. And by the time they did, I think that the days of publishing on 8 strains had come and gone. So we kind of missed the boat. But it did open the door for me to this whole idea that we could use whole genome sequencing as a way to drill down further into the question of what mutations are actually causing resistance. Are there differences in fitness? Can we take those back to the lab, make isogenic strains, and then test whether those have fitness costs and what those fitness costs consist of? So we did a number of studies. We collected a much bigger strain sample and looked for novel mutations associated with resistance. We're continuing to do that work in some of the studies that Randy mentioned. We now have about almost 2,000 strains sequenced and with MICs, and so we're really able to focus on this. We've also been able to expand the sources of these, so we've been continuing to do clinical research in Peru for now almost 20 years, and we have an enormous archive of stored strains, as well as have a number of collaborators who produce drug-resistant strains that allow us to do this work. So one of the questions that we've asked is, are the known mutations adequate to explain resistance? And could those all be put on a diagnostic tool that would allow point-of-care diagnosis of drug-resistant TB that would then allow those physicians to tailor drugs rather than using standardized drug regimens at the time that patients are diagnosed? And one of the things we learned is that the set of known resistance mutations does not really explain most resistance in TB. It might to the couple of first-line drugs, but certainly not to the second-line drugs, where you only get about 60 to 80% sensitivity, including everything that we know now. So suggesting that more sequencing needs to be done, or that there's other more complex mechanisms of resistance. So around that time, we decided to pursue the question of the transmissibility and the fitness costs of drug-resistant TB by doing a clinical study. And we wrote for and proposed and wrote a grant to measure the transmissibility of TB in household contexts of people exposed to a drug-sensitive case and a drug-resistant case in Lima, Peru. And again, I think I've mentioned sometimes, you get good news and it turns out not to be as great as you think. It's often the case you get bad news and it's never quite as bad as you think. At least that's how my career has gone. Our first time proposing this was, our grant got a great score, but then was not funded because NIH said that wasn't their priority. So we were crushed. But they came back to us not very long afterwards and said, well, why don't you submit that as a program project grant? And on the second round, we were funded, which is probably a good thing because it was such a big project that we probably needed to rest up before we took it on. In fact, my project officer sent me this note. once I was funded, and little did I know how right that was. So we set up to work in this environment. This is our shanty towns that really, there's something like, the population of Lima, Peru is about between 12 and 14 million, and about 90% of those people live in these kinds of conditions, whereas if you travel as a tourist, you'll see really modern, thriving city, but only about 2 or 3 billion people live in that modern, thriving city. So we embarked on this project that continues to this day. We finished our transmissibility study, but we are continuing to recruit people in this environment. And we had many, many ups and downs over the about 8 years it took us to do this project. And that's what happens if you try to recruit 18,000 people in a setting like this, which is what we did. We recruited and prospectively followed 18,000 people. And this is the kind of household-based work that we did. It was hard, and it was actually, very unrewarding at first, but I didn't think about it too carefully. If I had, I would have realized that as a junior faculty member, you really don't want to take on a project that isn't going to come to fruition for at least 5 and maybe 8 years. So no papers, on this particular project for a long time. Our promotions depend not only on getting grant funding, but also on publication. So it was a bit undertaking that I wouldn't recommend to other junior faculty, but it did work out. Most of the time, instead of doing real science, we were doing things like hiring and managing this 300-person team that was doing the actual day-to-day work in Lima, or buying GIS machines and making sure they worked, even though in these hills outside of the city, or getting our truck that hauled tuberculin skin test materials all around the city, weighing kids. Finally, we had been using a lab that was the national TB lab in Lima, and we had so overwhelmed their capacity that we were basically interfering with healthcare. And so we decided we needed to get our own lab. We bought a container lab. So this is the thing you can do. You can order a container lab, a BSL-3, and I think there's BSL-4 container labs that you can buy. They're fitted out in South Africa. You specify what you want. They stick the container on a ship, and they ship it to the nearest port, or the port that you want to ship to. So it happens that Lima is a port, and our lab eventually came. They dropped it on the way from the port to where we put it, and it needed some repairs. But it's been functioning ever since, and here it is. So none of this was easy, and I'm not sure that I would recommend this to any new scientist, male or female. I'd had 2 more kids during the time after I had my first in residency, and while it was certainly easier to manage this, my schedule as a graduate student and as a junior faculty member, than it had been as a resident, I struggled to do all the things I was supposed to do to be a successful young scientist. Our youngest is now a lovely, lively, and totally together 19-year-old, but she spent much of the first few years of her life screaming. And there she is. And yes, this almost certainly slowed me down enormously in terms of my professional advancement, but I wouldn't do it differently for anything in the world. This child let us know exactly what she needed to thrive. And she taught us a huge amount about priorities. And so I don't regret those years in any way. And of course, running a study in Lima meant that I had to travel, and travel meant that I had to be away from my young kids. And one of the consequences of this was that I rarely went to scientific meetings. I didn't think I had time to do both. And so for a long time, I didn't do the kind of networking that we've been talking about today, and that often really helps move careers forward. I now know that this is a big problem for both men and women parents. I'm on a promotions committee at Harvard where we talk about this incessantly. But I also know that there's now a number of ways that you can overcome these problems. One can ask for funding to take a nanny with them to a conference. One can do webinars that are national conferences, but you can do it from your desk. And so things have changed somewhat for the better. And it's up to us to make sure that we let our young parent or older parent know that these tools are out there. So let me fast forward. After we set up our field site in Peru, this was the hard work of many, many people, but it's been rewarding. It's allowed us to focus not only on the question of drug resistance, but also on host factors that are associated with TB progression. The way our study was designed was to look at people who've been exposed to TB and then follow them until they progress to active disease. And that allowed us to establish both a pipeline for these genome-wide association studies we were doing on resistance, but also to look at host factors like diabetes and TB. And that's work that we've done with Randy, and I'm not sure if Brendan's still in the audience. There he is. So Brendan is a fabulous example of a parent who has managed to be an incredibly successful junior scientist, and he's definitely someone you want to talk to if you want to figure out how to manage it. I'm still not sure how he does it. Another kind of one of those kinds of random events. One of my students, this is now going back a few years, I got interested in diabetes because one of my doctoral students had just taken a meta-analysis class. She had decided to write a paper in that class on diabetes, and she said, oh, I want to do this again, so can I look at diabetes and TB? And so, sure, why not? So she wrote this paper on diabetes and the risk of tuberculosis. And this now ends up being my single most cited paper in the literature. So some of these random events are wonderful to follow up on, and it's important to be able to have the space to do it, right? So during this time, I obviously had a number of graduate students and postdocs, both men and women, although I found increasingly that the people in my group are women. And I think that in part that's because people who expect that they may need to take maternity leave during their training try to find mentors who have been there and done that. And so I certainly had. I had one young woman who actually had 3 pregnancies during the time she was in my group. And 3 of the 4 pregnancies she's had altogether. And she's now a successful faculty member at Harvard. I think it slowed her down quite a bit to have multiple interruptions in the years of training. And at the time I worried that it was going to slow me down quite a bit. But in retrospect, really, it had so little impact, those few months in which someone's gone, in the scheme of things, are really quite negligible in my mind. So as Randy mentioned, in addition to this work on TB, I've been continuing to work with the NGO Partners in Health. In that role, I try to organize the research that is based around their clinical efforts. And that began mostly in infectious diseases, but has now expanded to include non-communicable diseases. There's a big surgery initiative to try to introduce surgery where there hasn't been surgery in the past. There's a mental health initiative to introduce that kind of care. So the idea is to provide complex care that is not usually provided in low and middle income countries. And then my job has been to try to find research opportunities within that scope. So I lead a core of epidemiologists and biostatisticians who are involved in that work, all of whom are women. And not really by choice, in the same, for the same kinds of pressures or not pressures, but inducements that have 85% of your students being women in vet school. And I give them the same advice that I would give any student or trainee here today. That, we've talked about these things already. You need to have confidence in yourself. You have to not compromise what you're doing. Because but by compromising, I mean don't compromise your own needs. And often those needs are around your own family. And so, if you need help managing a personal life, and by personal life I mean a family, then you need to seek help from the people who can give it to you, who are usually your mentors. If they're not people who've offered you help in the past, just go and ask for it. You need to let them know what your issues are. I've taken to dealing with the issues of the discomfort people feel around self-promotion by having my women junior faculty write each other's CVs. So they usually have no problem whatsoever being promoting of their fellow women faculty. and but they have trouble doing it for themselves. And when they write the CV of the person sitting next to them, they do a beautiful job. So I thought, this is easy. We'll just switch, and it's actually been quite successful. Anyway, I can delineate, as I have, a lot of steps that I've taken to getting to where I am. But I was wondering when Randy and Candy asked me to do this, was there ever a moment when I decided, okay, I'm a successful woman scientist and I can come and talk about this? I recall one possible day, perhaps. I've been on the NIH dissection for about 8 years, off and on. And when I first started, I was really quite unhappy about it. I went to my first session. I worked really hard. I read there were a couple of proposals I really liked, and one in particular. And it was something I knew a lot about. So I thought, okay, this is great. I'm going to be the person in the room who's got expertise on this topic. So I presented and said, this is a great proposal. We should fund it. Here's what's good about it. And then an older male colleague, who was not an epidemiologist, this was an epidemiology grant, got up and said, well, no, that's all wrong, and it's not a good grant, and we shouldn't fund it. And I was taken aback. I could tell that the room thought, oh, we don't know who she is, and we know him, and that they were going to vote on his side. And I sat there tongue-tied. So I was like, well, I said my piece, and he said his piece, and I guess that's the end of the story, and I lost, right? And I felt really bad about it. I felt, I'm not going to be effective in this role if I can't do a better job of making this case. So forward to a couple of years later, I was in the same position. I had the grant that I really liked. I had a male colleague who wasn't very keen about it. And I had done my homework at this point. And so I said my piece, he said his piece, and I came back and said, yes, thank you for that, but here's why I don't agree with you on a number of points. And I said them calmly, but confidently, and I could tell that people were listening to what I had to say. At the end of that meeting, a couple of my colleagues came and thanked me for having supported that grant. And one woman came and said, I was a temporary member of this committee today, but I've decided I will sign on as a permanent member because I realize that I can make a difference. And that was a day where I felt, I learned to stand up for that sense of self-confidence that we feel like is self-promoting needs to be used to promote everyone else and to make sure that we kind of carve the pathway for people who follow us. So here's the summary of what I've just said. Don't listen to people who tell you that you don't understand what you're doing. Don't listen to your inner voice telling you you're dumb. You're not dumb. You need to work as hard as you can, but not at the cost of taking care of your family and your friends and loved ones. You have to, I'm sorry, I was on the wrong one. For me, one of the things that's actually worked is letting things happen, things that I didn't expect. Jumping into, say, doing a PhD program without knowing where the tuition would come from. Jumping into projects when people ask me to without realizing, sort of thinking through. I think if we think too much ahead, we get really constrained. And so we have to keep some flexibility as we go. I also found that one of the things I learned as residency is to be as absolutely efficient as possible so that I could then go home and do something else. Right? And that may be the best thing I learned in residency. Don't spend any more time doing than it takes to do what you need to do. And lastly, I know this might be controversial, but I think you can go ahead and be angry if you're angry, and use that anger to speak up for yourself. So I could tell you stories about my kids all day long, but let me just tell you, as we end here, one of my favorite ones. So my daughter, the youngest, the feisty one, in about 5th or 6th grade, she decided that she thought the teachers were calling on the boys more often than they were calling on the girls. And she came home and she was really outraged. I mean, absolutely outraged. So she decided she would prove it. Now, she didn't like math any more than I had liked math. And in fact, in 1st grade, she had decided she would hold a protest against math. So she made a poster. We said we had found that the way to deal with her kind of feistiness was to kind of play along with it. We said, you could still have a rally. It's a great idea, right? So she made a poster saying "Down with math." And she rolled it up and she took it to school. I'm like, oh, maybe we should have discouraged that. So I was glad to say that she did chicken out, and she left that poster in her desk. But this was now in 5th or 6th grade, and she didn't really probably like math any more than that. But she decided that she would plan this study, and she would count the number of times per gender-specific hand raises that the teachers called. And she kept a notebook. She planned the study. She wrote up the results, and she knew the proportion of hand raises answered by gender. And she was right. They answered boys' questions way more than girls' questions. She had put down everything except the p-values, right? And the thing is that when she presented it to her teachers, I think they were more surprised that she could do the math than they were that she was that feisty. They knew her pretty well at that point. But they took it seriously, and they said, oh yeah, you know, we didn't know we were doing that. And I suspect some of the reason, because they were really very progressive teachers, is that there was this backlash that boys were somehow not engaged in that period. But whatever, once they knew that she was counting, it changed. And you know, I suspect it went back to baseline at some point. But I just loved it, that she could be angry and then use that anger not only to make a change, but also to learn something, because, you know, I think she suddenly realized that math could be a tool. So go for it. You know, when you do, you're not only supporting your own future, but the future of the people coming after you. So thank you.